Comment where you're watching from today. On a crisp autumn morning in 1946, when air travel was still a luxury reserved for the privileged few, an encounter on a first-class flight from Boston to New York would become a story passed down through generations of baseball fans. It was the kind of morning where fate had arranged all the pieces perfectly for an unforgettable lesson in humility and respect. The first-class cabin of the early morning flight buzzed with the usual pre-takeoff energy. Sarah Chin, a flight attendant with 5 years of experience handling the most demanding of passengers, noticed something different about the distinguished-looking gentleman in seat 2C. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, his well-worn but immaculate suit speaking of someone who understood the value of maintaining appearances without feeling the need to flaunt wealth. Marcus Blackwood, a rising star in the banking industry, strode through the cabin like he owned it, his tailored Italian suit and gold watch screaming of new money and inflated self-importance. At 42, he had already earned a reputation for treating service staff with barely concealed disdain, and this morning would prove no different. Thomas O'Malley, an elderly passenger who had been a baseball fan since the days when tickets cost a quarter, sat quietly in his seat, his aged eyes twinkling with recognition as they fell upon the gentleman in 2C. His weathered hands clutched an old baseball, worn smooth by decades of hopeful carrying, just in case a moment like this ever arrived. Maria Rodriguez, the head flight attendant, had been briefed about their special passenger during the pre-flight meeting. 20 years in the industry had taught her how to handle delicate situations with discretion, and she had carefully instructed her team to treat the gentleman in 2C with respect while maintaining his privacy. The morning's calm was first disturbed when Marcus Blackwood discovered his preferred seat, 2C, was already occupied. "Excuse me," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of assumed authority, "but I believe you're in my seat." He stood in the aisle, blocking other passengers, his expensive briefcase held like a shield of superiority. Sarah Chin quickly approached, flight manifest in hand. "Mr. Blackwood, your assigned seat is actually 3A. I'd be happy to show you," but before she could finish, Blackwood cut her off with a dismissive wave. "There must be some mistake. I always sit in 2C. It's my lucky seat, and I'm not about to let some—" He paused, looking down his nose at the older gentleman, retired factory worker or whatever ruin my morning routine. The gentleman in 2C looked up slowly, his eyes carrying the weight of countless stadiums, of cheering crowds and legendary moments. He smiled politely, beginning to reach for his seatbelt to stand, but Maria Rodriguez stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Blackwood, I assure you that 3A is your assigned seat for this flight. It offers the same excellent amenities as 2C. Thomas O'Malley watched the scene unfold with growing indignation, his gnarled fingers tightening around the baseball in his pocket. Dr. James Wilson, a sports historian traveling to give a lecture at Columbia University, set aside his morning paper, his academic interest piqued by the brewing confrontation. Blackwood, unused to being denied anything, especially in first class, raised his voice slightly. "Do you have any idea who I am? I manage portfolios worth more than this entire airline. I've flown this route every week for the past 5 years, and I always sit in 2C. His face had taken on a reddish hue that clashed with his pale blue tie. The gentleman in 2C spoke then, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes not from money or position, but from having lived a life that had earned genuine respect. "Son," he said, the word carrying neither condescension nor anger, "perhaps we could solve this amicably. Though I must say, in baseball and in life, I've learned it's not where you sit that matters, but how you play the game." Something about the man's voice, about the way he carried himself, made several passengers look up from their newspapers and magazines. Helen Crawford, an elderly passenger who had been pretending to read her book while watching the drama unfold, gasped softly as recognition dawned in her eyes. Blackwood, however, was too wrapped up in his own importance to notice the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. "Baseball?" he scoffed. "What does baseball have to do with anything? This is business class, not some bleachers at a minor league game. I don't need life lessons from someone who probably couldn't afford a ticket to Yankee Stadium." David Mitchell, the co-pilot who had stepped into the cabin to check on something with Maria, froze mid-stride. His face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something approaching horror as he realized what he was witnessing. Sarah Chin, maintaining her professional composure even as her heart raced at the unfolding situation, tried once more to defuse the tension. "Mr. Blackwood, if you'll allow me to show you to your seat in 3A." But Blackwood was on a roll now, his voice carrying through the cabin. "You know what? Keep the seat. I'll take 3A, but I want it noted that this is unacceptable. And you," he turned to the gentleman, "enjoy my lucky seat. Though I doubt someone like you understands anything about luck or success." The gentleman in 2C simply nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Thomas O'Malley couldn't contain himself any longer. Standing up despite his arthritic knees, he turned to Blackwood and spoke with the righteous indignation of a true baseball fan. "Young man, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Before anyone could answer, Carol Peterson, the gate agent, hurried onto the plane with a stack of paperwork that needed immediate attention. She stopped short at the sight of the gentleman in 2C, her professional demeanor cracking for just a moment as she too recognized him. The gentleman raised a hand gently, a gesture that somehow managed to quiet the entire cabin. "Please," he said, "there's no need for introductions. Let's all just enjoy our flight." But it was too late. The whispers had already started, spreading through the cabin like a wave. Bobby Thompson, the young flight attendant who had been stowing bags in the overhead compartments, nearly dropped a briefcase as he finally got a good look at the passenger in 2C. His father had raised him on stories of this very man, had shown him grainy footage and yellowed newspaper clippings. Marcus Blackwood, still standing in the aisle, remained oblivious to the change in atmosphere, to the way other passengers were now looking at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. He was too busy making a show of arranging himself in seat 3A, muttering about writing letters to the airline's board of directors. Dr. Wilson, who had been documenting baseball history for decades, reached for his notebook. He knew he was witnessing something that would deserve its own chapter in his next book. The irony was almost too perfect, a self-important businessman lecturing Babe Ruth about success and lucky seats. As the whispers continued to circulate, Sarah Chin noticed the gentleman in 2C giving her a small wink, as if they were sharing a private joke. She realized then that he had never intended to make a scene, had been willing to give up his seat just to keep the peace. It was everyone else who couldn't bear to see the Sultan of Swat treated with such disrespect. The story was far from over, though. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the weight of Blackwood's mistake hung in the air like a fly ball at the top of its arc, just waiting to come down. And come down it would, in a way that would ensure this flight would never be forgotten by anyone who witnessed it. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into what should have been a peaceful morning flight. But the undercurrent of tension remained, sparked by Marcus Blackwood's continued muttering about proper seating arrangements and customer service. What he didn't realize was that his moment of reckoning was approaching faster than a Babe Ruth home run. Thomas O'Malley had spent the first 20 minutes of the flight gathering his courage. The baseball in his pocket, carried for 30 years in hopes of this very moment, felt heavier than ever. His hands trembled slightly as he finally stood up, using his cane for support, and made his way towards seat 2C. Sarah Chin watched the elderly man's approach with a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity. She had seen countless autograph seekers in her years of service, but there was something different about O'Malley's demeanor, a lifetime of devotion rather than a moment's excitement. "Excuse me, sir," O'Malley said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of baseball memories. "I was there that day in '23 at Yankee Stadium, when you hit that homer that landed in the railroad cars. I was just a boy then, but I've never seen anything like it since." The gentleman in 2C's face lit up with genuine warmth. "That was a good day," he replied, his voice carrying across the cabin. "Baseball was different then, simpler maybe, but every bit as beautiful." His words caused Marcus Blackwood to look up sharply from his laptop, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Dr. James Wilson, unable to contain his professional interest any longer, leaned forward in his seat. "Mr. Ruth," he said, "your impact on baseball statistics revolutionized how we think about the game. I'm actually on my way to give a lecture about how your 1927 season changed sports analytics forever." The name dropped like a thunderbolt in the cabin. Marcus Blackwood's fingers froze over his keyboard as the color drained from his face. Helen Crawford, watching the scene unfold, couldn't suppress a small, satisfied smile at the businessman's obvious discomfort. Maria Rodriguez, seeing the moment of recognition ripple through the cabin, smoothly approached with a fresh cup of coffee for Ruth. "Would you care for anything else, Mr. Ruth?" she asked, her professional tone carrying just a hint of warmth that acknowledged the legend in their midst. Babe Ruth accepted the coffee with a gracious nod. "Just George is fine," he said, though everyone knew nobody had called him just George since he first stepped onto Yankee Stadium's hallowed ground. His humility only served to heighten the contrast with Blackwood's earlier behavior. Bobby Thompson, the young flight attendant, was practically vibrating with excitement as he passed by, straightening items that didn't need straightening just to stay close to the conversation. His father had played minor league ball and had taught him to revere the name Ruth as something approaching religious devotion. "The game's changed quite a bit since your day, hasn't it, Mr. Ruth?" Blackwood suddenly spoke up, trying desperately to sound casual, as if he hadn't just spent the last half hour insulting the greatest baseball player who ever lived. His voice carried a nervous tremor that hadn't been there before. Ruth turned in his seat, fixing Blackwood with a gaze that had stared down the greatest pitchers of an era. "Some things change," he said evenly, "but respect and good sportsmanship, those never go out of style." The cabin fell silent, every passenger aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. David Mitchell, the co-pilot, chose that moment to emerge from the cockpit, ostensibly to check on something but really to catch a glimpse of the legend. His father had been a groundskeeper at Fenway Park during Ruth's Red Sox days, and family lore held that Ruth had once shared a sandwich with him during a rain delay. Carol Peterson, who had remained on board longer than necessary just to witness events unfold, finally had to depart for her gate duties. But before she left, she pulled Sarah Chin aside and whispered, "My grandfather would never believe this. He saw Ruth hit 3 home runs in one game back in '26. Thomas O'Malley, still standing by Ruth's seat, finally gathered the courage to pull out his treasured baseball. "Mr. Ruth," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've carried this ball for 30 years, hoping I might meet you someday. Would you?" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Ruth took the ball with the same reverence he'd held every baseball in his career. "What's your name, friend?" he asked, pulling a pen from his jacket pocket, clearly not the first time he'd been prepared for such a request. "Thomas O'Malley, sir. I was 12 years old when I saw you play for the first time. Changed my life forever." The old man's eyes glistened with unshed tears as Ruth signed the baseball with the same flourish that had graced thousands of autographs before. Dr. Wilson watched the interaction with academic interest, noting how Ruth treated every fan interaction as if it were the most important moment of his day. It was a stark lesson in genuine greatness versus the artificial importance that men like Blackwood tried to project. Marcus Blackwood, meanwhile, had shrunk into his seat in 3A, his earlier bravado replaced by a palpable sense of shame. His laptop remained open but forgotten as he watched the scene unfold, each interaction between Ruth and his fellow passengers driving home the magnitude of his earlier behavior. Helen Crawford, who had been quietly observing everything, finally spoke up. "Mr. Ruth," she said, her voice carrying the clarity of age, "my late husband was a vendor at the old Yankee Stadium. He always said you never passed by without a kind word for the working folks." Ruth's face softened at her words. "The folks who work the hardest often get noticed the least," he replied, with a meaningful glance at Sarah Chen and the other flight attendants. "But they're the ones who keep the whole game running, whether it's baseball or anything else." The lesson wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin, least of all Marcus Blackwood, who seemed to be trying to disappear into his expensive suit. His earlier comments about factory workers and minor league games hung in the air like evidence of his own foolishness. Maria Rodriguez, seeing an opportunity to ease the tension, began preparing for the in-flight service. "We have a special meal prepared for you, Mr. Ruth," she said, "though I'm afraid it might not compare to the hot dogs at Yankee Stadium." Ruth's legendary laugh filled the cabin. "Nothing ever does," he said, his good humor infectious. Even Blackwood couldn't suppress a small smile, though it was tinged with embarrassment. Bobby Thompson, passing by with a service cart, couldn't help adding, "My father says your appetite was as legendary as your home runs, Mr. Ruth." The young man immediately blushed, worried he'd spoken out of turn, but Ruth just laughed again. "Your father's right about that," Ruth replied. "Can't hit home runs on an empty stomach." The casual way he referenced his incredible achievements only highlighted how unnecessary Blackwood's earlier boasting had been. As the flight continued, more passengers found reasons to walk past Ruth's seat, each carrying their own baseball memory they hoped to share. Ruth received them all with the same patient grace, turning what could have been an ordinary flight into something memorable for everyone aboard. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had demanded the lucky seat 2C had given up the chance to sit next to one of the most famous Americans who ever lived. But the real lesson was in how Ruth handled the entire situation, showing that true greatness doesn't need to announce itself. Sarah Chen, making her rounds through the cabin, noticed how Ruth made a point of learning and using everyone's name, from the newest flight attendant to the elderly passengers sharing their memories. It was a masterclass in how to treat people, regardless of their station in life. As the plane began its initial descent into New York, Marcus Blackwood found himself facing a choice: continue hiding in his embarrassment or find a way to make amends for his earlier behavior. The decision he would make would determine whether this story ended as a simple tale of comeuppance or something more meaningful. As the plane began its approach to New York, Marcus Blackwood found himself in an unfamiliar position, humbled, embarrassed, and desperate to make things right. The weight of his earlier behavior sat heavily on his shoulders as he watched Babe Ruth continue to charm everyone in the cabin with his gracious demeanor and genuine interest in their stories. Sarah Chen had just finished serving the last round of drinks when she noticed Blackwood shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes fixed on the baseball legend in 2C. She'd seen many difficult passengers over the years, but rarely had she witnessed such a dramatic transformation in someone's demeanor during a single flight. Thomas O'Malley, still beaming from his interaction with Ruth, had returned to his seat but kept stealing glances at his newly signed baseball, as if afraid it might disappear if he looked away too long. Dr. James Wilson had moved to a closer seat, with Maria Rodriguez's discreet permission, and was quietly taking notes on the unprecedented interaction he was witnessing. "Mr. Ruth," Blackwood finally spoke up, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, "I owe you an apology." The cabin grew quiet, the other passengers turning to watch this unexpected development. Ruth turned in his seat, his expression open and free of judgment. "When I was a boy," Blackwood continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "my father used to tell me stories about watching you play. He worked 2 jobs to afford tickets to Yankees games. But I forgot those stories somewhere along the way, forgot what really matters." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Helen Crawford dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, moved by the raw honesty in Blackwood's voice. Bobby Thompson paused in his duties, sensing that he was witnessing something significant. Even David Mitchell had found another excuse to emerge from the cockpit, not wanting to miss this moment. Ruth's response was characteristic of the man who had changed baseball forever. "Son," he said, using the same word that had earlier sparked Blackwood's ire, but now carried a different weight. "In baseball, we say it ain't over till it's over. Same goes for learning life's important lessons." Maria Rodriguez, who had seen countless dramas unfold in first class over the years, recognized that this was something different. This wasn't just a passenger trying to smooth over bad behavior. This was a genuine moment of transformation. Blackwood reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn photograph. With slightly trembling hands, he walked it over to Ruth. This was taken at Yankee Stadium in 1927. "That little boy in the stands? That's me with my father. We waited 3 hours after the game, hoping to meet you. We didn't get the chance that day, but my father said it was still the best day of his life." Ruth studied the photograph with genuine interest, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I remember that game," he said, surprising everyone. "Doubleheader against the White Sox. Rained earlier that morning, but the sky cleared up just in time. He pointed at something in the background of the photo. See that flag in center field? Wasn't moving at all, perfect day for hitting. The detail in Ruth's recollection seemed to affect Blackwood deeply. He sank into the empty seat across the aisle, authorized by a quick nod from Sarah Chin. My father passed away last year, he said quietly. He kept that photograph on his desk until the day he died. I've been carrying it with me ever since, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what it meant. Dr. Wilson leaned forward, his academic interest now mixed with genuine emotion. Mr. Blackwood, he said gently, would you mind if I included this story in my book? It's a powerful example of how baseball connects generations. Before Blackwood could respond, Ruth spoke up. Speaking of connections, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, I've got something here your father might have appreciated. He pulled out a baseball, different from the one he'd signed for O'Malley. This one was weathered, with distinct markings that any baseball fan would recognize. This, Ruth explained, is from the 1927 season. One of my practice balls. Not worth much to collectors, but it carries just as many memories as the game balls. He held it out to Blackwood, whose eyes widened in disbelief. Thomas O'Malley, watching from his seat, understood the significance immediately. The 27 season, he whispered loudly enough for others to hear, that was the year of the 60 home runs. Several passengers nodded in recognition of the historic achievement. Blackwood took the ball with reverence, his earlier corporate demeanor completely forgotten. I don't know what to say, he managed, his voice thick with emotion. This is more than I deserve after how I behaved. Ruth's response carried the wisdom of a man who had seen both the heights of success and the depths of hardship. Baseball teaches us that everyone strikes out sometimes, he said. The question is what you do when you step up to the plate again. Sarah Chin, who had witnessed countless instances of entitled behavior in first class, found herself moved by the transformation. She quietly arranged for a fresh cup of coffee to be brought to Blackwood, a small gesture of recognition for his humility. Maria Rodriguez seized the moment to add her own touch of grace to the situation. Mr. Blackwood, she said, would you like to move to the seat next to Mr. Ruth for the remainder of our flight? I believe we can make an exception to our usual seating arrangements. The offer was both a professional courtesy and a symbolic gesture of redemption. As Blackwood carefully moved to his new seat, Helen Crawford spoke up again. You know, she said, her voice carrying the weight of years, my husband always said that baseball was just life in 9 innings. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but you always have another chance to play the game right. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as a tense confrontation had evolved into something approaching a flying baseball symposium. Other passengers began sharing their own memories, each story drawing appreciative nods from Ruth and creating a sense of community among the travelers. Bobby Thompson, the young flight attendant, found himself drawn into the conversation when Ruth asked about his father's minor league career. Dad pitched for the Toledo Mud Hens, he said proudly. Never made it to the majors, but he always said just being part of the game was enough. Your father had it right, Ruth replied. Some of the best baseball men I ever knew never played an inning in the big leagues. They just loved the game for what it was. His words carried special weight for Blackwood, who was beginning to understand that true greatness lay in how you treated others, not in what seat you occupied. Dr. Wilson's notebook was filling rapidly with observations, not just about the historical significance of the moment, but about the human dynamics playing out before him. This, he murmured to himself, is why baseball endures. It's not just about the game, it's about redemption, second chances, and the connections we make. As the plane began its final approach to New York, the cabin had become something of a temporary baseball museum. Ruth's practice ball was carefully passed around, each passenger holding a piece of history for a moment before reverently passing it on. Even those who weren't baseball fans found themselves caught up in the spirit of the moment. David Mitchell, making one final appearance from the cockpit, couldn't resist sharing his own connection. My father, he said, the one who was a groundskeeper at Fenway? He always said Mr. Ruth treated the grounds crew like they were as important as the players. Said it taught him more about leadership than any management book ever could. The story prompted Blackwood to share something of his own. "In all my years of business," he admitted, "I never understood why my father kept that old photo on his desk. Now I think I do. It wasn't just about baseball, it was about remembering what really matters in life." As the New York skyline became visible through the windows, the passengers realized they were part of something special. This wasn't just a flight where a rude businessman had been put in his place. It was a lesson in humility, redemption, and the enduring power of America's pastime to bring people together. As the plane touched down at New York's LaGuardia Airport, no one in the first-class cabin was in a hurry to leave. The past few hours had transformed a routine morning flight into something extraordinary, a moment in time where baseball's greatest legend had turned an uncomfortable confrontation into a masterclass in humility, forgiveness, and the enduring spirit of America's pastime. Sarah Chin began her final cabin check with a different perspective than when the flight began. She had witnessed countless dramas in first class over the years, but never had she seen such a profound transformation in a passenger as she had in Marcus Blackwood. As she passed his seat, she noticed he was carefully wrapping the 1927 practice ball in his silk handkerchief, treating it with the reverence of a religious artifact. "You know," Babe Ruth said, watching Blackwood's careful handling of the ball, "that ball has seen better days, but it's got more stories to tell now. Sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones in perfect condition, they're the ones that carry a little history with them." The words seemed to carry a deeper meaning that wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. Thomas O'Malley, still holding his own signed baseball, spoke up from his seat. "Mr. Ruth, my grandson's Little League team plays their championship game this weekend. Would you mind if I shared this story with them? I think they could learn something from it." His voice carried the wisdom of someone who understood that the day's events transcended baseball. "Share it with everyone," Ruth replied with a warm smile. "Baseball's always been about more than just the game. It's about second chances, respect, and learning from our strikeouts." He glanced meaningfully at Blackwood, who nodded in understanding. Dr. James Wilson closed his notebook, which was now filled with observations that would form the heart of a very different lecture than the one he'd originally planned to give at Columbia. "Mr. Ruth," he said, "I've studied baseball history for decades, but today I learned more about why the game matters than I ever did from statistics and record books." Maria Rodriguez, who had seen her share of celebrity passengers, realized that this flight would stand out in her 20 years of service. "In all my years of flying," she said, "I've never seen first class feel so much like a family gathering." The other passengers nodded in agreement, understanding that they had been part of something special. Helen Crawford, who had watched the entire drama unfold, shared her own observation. "My late husband would have loved this," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He always said baseball was a metaphor for life. Sometimes you're the home run hero, sometimes you're the rookie who needs to learn humility, but there's always another game tomorrow." Bobby Thompson, gathering his courage, approached Ruth with a final request. "Mr. Ruth, my father's birthday is next month. Would you mind signing something for him? Tell me everything I know about baseball, including why you were the greatest to ever play the game." The young flight attendant's voice trembled slightly with emotion. Ruth's response was characteristic of his generosity. Taking out his pen one last time, he signed not just an autograph, but added a personal message. "To a man who understands that teaching your kid to love baseball is as important as any home run I ever hit." The words brought tears to Bobby's eyes. David Mitchell, making one final appearance from the cockpit as the plane taxied to the gate, couldn't resist sharing a last detail. "My father," he said, "the groundskeeper at Fenway? He passed away last year, but his last coherent words were about the day you shared your sandwich with him during that rain delay. Some kindnesses never fade, Mr. Ruth." Marcus Blackwood, who had been quietly reflecting, finally spoke up again. "I've been thinking about my father's photo," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier pretense. "For years, I kept it in my briefcase as a good luck charm, but I never really honored what it represented. Today changed that." Ruth turned to him with genuine interest. "How so?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "My father worked those 2 jobs to buy Yankees tickets because he believed in the power of dreams," Blackwood explained. He wanted me to understand that true success isn't about which seat you sit in, it's about how you treat people along the way. I forgot that lesson somewhere between the minor leagues and the corner office. Sarah Chin, who had been quietly listening, shared her own perspective. In my 5 years of flying, I've served countless successful people, she said. But today I learned that real greatness isn't about demanding respect, it's about giving it freely to others. As the seatbelt sign dinged off for the final time, no one made the usual rush for their belongings. Instead, the passengers lingered, aware that once they left the aircraft, this magical intersection of past and present, of success and humility, would become just a memory. Ruth stood slowly, his imposing frame still carrying the dignity that had made him more than just a baseball player. "Before we all go our separate ways," he said, "I want you to remember something. Baseball, like life, isn't about the mistakes we make, it's about how we recover from them." Mr. Blackwood here showed us that today. The passengers began gathering their belongings, each carrying more than they had brought on board. Thomas O'Malley had his signed baseball and a story his grandson's team would never forget. Dr. Wilson had material for a lecture that would touch hearts as well as minds. Marcus Blackwood had a practice ball from 1927 and, more importantly, a renewed connection to his father's values. As they prepared to disembark, Maria Rodriguez noticed something remarkable. The usual rush to be first off the plane was absent. Instead, passengers were letting others go ahead, sharing final thoughts and exchanges, treating each other with the kind of respect that had been modeled for them over the past few hours. Helen Crawford summed up the mood perfectly as she gathered her belongings. "You know," she said, "my husband used to say that baseball survived all these years because it reminds us of what we can be at our best. Today proved him right." Bobby Thompson, standing by the exit to bid farewell to the passengers, received more than just polite nods. Each person who passed acknowledged him with genuine warmth, having learned from Ruth's example that every person deserves respect, regardless of their role. As Marcus Blackwood prepared to leave, he paused by his original lucky seat 2C. "Funny," he said almost to himself, "how I thought this seat was so important. Turns out the real luck was in being exactly where I needed to be to learn what really matters." The final moments of deplaning felt more like the end of a family reunion than a routine flight. Passengers exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch, and shared final observations about what they had witnessed. Dr. Wilson announced that he would send each of them a copy of his book when it was published, knowing that they were now part of baseball history themselves. Babe Ruth was the last to leave, pausing at the door to shake hands with each member of the crew. To Sarah Chin, he said something that she would never forget. "You handled everything today with grace and dignity. That's worth more than any home run I ever hit." As the passengers dispersed into the terminal, each carrying their own piece of this extraordinary story, they understood that they had experienced something rare, a moment where sport, humanity, and redemption had intersected perfectly, like a well-executed double play or a perfectly timed swing. The story of the flight would be told and retold, passed down through generations like a cherished baseball card. But its true value wasn't in the celebrity encounter or even the historical significance. It was in the lesson that true greatness lies not in demanding respect, but in giving it, and that it's never too late to step up to the plate and take another swing at being a better person. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed your perspective on what really matters in life? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible true stories from history.